So I thought before moving on into the introduction that we would take a detour here and look at the charts in the back of Volume 1 of Decline of the West. He's got these big, long charts that show the morphology that he's talking about in vivid and very concrete detail. And he's got 3 charts. He doesn't have every civilization on here, probably because they just won't fit. But he's got 4 of them, depending on the chart. And the first chart is about the evolution of the intellect over time. And those 4 phases that we talked about last time, the pre-culture, early culture, late culture, and civilization, he calls, as far as the intellectual development goes, the spring period, the summer period, the autumn period, and the winter period. So he's very deliberate about the four phases being part of a kind of a cycle. And the second of these maps are the arts. It has to do with the evolution of the arts, which he's got the pre-cultural period, early culture, late culture, and the civilization period. And each of these has some substages that I thought it would be fun to look at. And then finally, he's got the political morphology, which follows pretty closely the structure of the artistic one, pre-cultural, early culture, late culture, and civilization. The civilization phase has 3 subphases in both the artistic and the political models. I think what we should do is look at the arts first. Those are more concrete, and you can see this method of analogy that he has just talked about, which is the means whereby to identify living forms. Dead forms are part of the world of the become, things that are dead. A dead body has become. It is no longer becoming. It has become. And mathematical law studies things as though they were dead. In many senses, the Western scientific mentality came out of the study of corpses. Vesalius's investigations into corpses. Think of Rembrandt's painting, the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp. The West has emerged with a whole bunch of laws that are based on the study of dead things. And it projects that onto the universe as though the universe were a dead thing, and it's not. So here we have this first of these charts compares the Egyptian civilization with the classical, the Arabian or Magian, which includes the Christian and Islamic, and also the Byzantine world, and the Western, also known as Faustian elsewhere. For the pre-cultural period, in Egypt, gets up and running about 3400 BC with the Tenite period. This would be the period of the Scorpion King. Spengler didn't know about the Scorpion King, but that's exactly where he would go. And it's at that point, about 3300 BC in Egypt, that with the tomb of the Scorpion King, writing first comes in, hieroglyphic writing being scrawled on little ivory plaques in that tomb, announce already the awakening, the beginning of a mentality. I don't think the Scorpion King was mummified yet, so that hasn't come in. This corresponds with the Mycenaean age, with the Greeks, and the Mycenaean architecture is a sort of, the tholoi, the dome-shaped tholoi begin to come in with a new burial style. And then this corresponds in the Arabian world with the Persian Seleucid period, and also the late classical Hellenistic with its heavy overlay, its pseudomorphic overlay on top of the Arabian world that hasn't yet awakened, but is awakening, which corresponds then in the Western with the Merovingian Carolingian period, when the West is first starting to wake up with the Carolingian period. So that's pre-culture. The culture period begins with an early period where he says ornament and architecture as elementary expressions of the young world feeling. Architecture is the key word here. So then with the formation of brand new forms of architecture connected with the cult of the dead and these new religions, these cultures wake up into the pre-culture, or out of the pre-culture into the culture period. The pre-culture period is still hesitant and uncertain of itself. There aren't any pyramids in Egypt yet. There are tombs, like the Scorpion King's tombs. No pyramids yet. Same thing with the Mycenaean age. The Doric architecture isn't there yet, but we have Mycenaean art and culture, which is essentially a non-entity because it's all derivative from the Minoans anyway, so it's not really, it hasn't found its legs yet there either. And the Carolingian period, of course, is also very uncertain of itself and based on an attempt to, a lot of it copies the architectural styles from the Arabs in the south in Spain, such as the candy striping that's also found at the palace, Charlemagne's palace at Aachen. Okay, so then we get the culture period proper with the formation now of an architecture of the fine arts of the finest, highest quality. Life history of a style formative of the entire inner being. Form language of deepest symbolic necessity. So there's that word necessity that we encountered last time. For Old Kingdom Egypt, we get phase one here, and there's two phases here. Birth and rise, forms sprung from the land, unconsciously shaped. Somehow this is all just a sort of dreamlike thing that just happens. Nobody really figures this out. It's not an intellectual thing. A religion comes in and dreams all of this into being, and it all emerges spontaneously out of the land like a dream. So we get the pyramids in Egypt come in. Then we get, in the classical civilization, now we get Doric architecture, Doric columns, most of it's built in wood at first. And then in the Arabian, now we begin to get, we get the first mosque, the Pantheon, which is a dome-shaped building just like a mosque, but it's still in the classical style. But nonetheless, Spengler says it's the first mosque, the first feeling of the world as a cavern, which is the essential idea of the Islamic world. And then, of course, we get the Gothic cathedrals coming in the West. So these are morphologically analogous. These are all analogous. Now, this second phase is kind of interesting because there's a disintegration of the forms. He says there's a completion of the early form languages and an exhaustion of their possibilities, and a contradiction happens. I find this phase quite interesting, actually. This is the 6th dynasty in Egypt when it falls apart. The pyramid cults are gone, and the first interregnum comes in. There's social chaos and anarchy, and there's a loss of touch with the grand, all the greatest pyramids date from the Old Kingdom, not the Middle Kingdom when they come back. So there's this kind of interesting disintegration of the style here. And then in classical culture we get the end of the Doric and Etruscan style, the end of the style, and a Proto-Corinthian early Attic vase painting style comes in. In the Arabian world, this is the disintegration of iconic pictorial art, the end of Syrian, Persian, and Coptic pictorial art, and the rise of mosaic painting and of arabesques. So we see the art here begin to shift as the pseudomorphosis in the Arabian civilization is gradually shed, and it shifts from an iconic tradition, especially like in Persian art, it shifts from an iconic tradition to, with the rise now of the arabesque, a properly Islamic art, which is an-iconic. So once again, there's a kind of disintegration of a previous form language in favor of a new one that's closer to the target that the culture is trying to express out of itself. And then we get, in the case of the West, we get the disintegration of fresco painting and the beginnings of the first oil painting. So this is the Renaissance now, which is an attempt to reanimate a dead form world. And he says Michelangelo was the last to try to breathe life into that dead form world because he was essentially dealing with an extinct art. The Greeks were the masters of sculpture. That begins to disintegrate at the same time that painting begins to shift from fresco, and you can see the transition in the history of Leonardo's art, where he painted the fresco of the Last Supper, and now that's doomed to disintegration, to oil painting. Oil painting now begins to come in, where now you've got portable canvases. You don't have to paint on disintegrating walls, from Van Eyck to Holbein. So once again, there's a disintegration of a previous form world based on fresco painting and statuary into a new world that's lighter and freer and more metaphysically self-certain and more metaphysically Faustian, which is the realm of oil painting. Okay, that's the early culture period. So we've seen how it has two phases, an architectural phase and then the phase of the various arts proper, and then their disintegration and transformation. This is what he means by an intercontradiction in the styles, and their transformation into another form language. So now we get phase two of the culture period is the late period. Now we have formation of a group of arts, urban and conscious, in the hands of great masters. This now is the apogee across the board on these four civilizations of their finest work, their greatest art. In the Middle Kingdom we have the 11th dynasty. We get lots of great sculpture. The pyramids aren't as good as they were in the Old Kingdom, but the sculpture is. It's quite good and in many ways better and more mature. So they're at their apogee with their sculpture. With the classical period, we have the period of the reign of fresco painting until Polygnotus, the rise of the plastic in the round, and the Greeks here too shed an Egyptian pseudomorphosis. The Greeks have actually, similar to the Muslims shedding their classical pseudomorphosis, their Hellenistic pseudomorphosis, the Greeks at this time now begin, and you can see how the early statues, the early Kouros statues, are imitating Egyptian statues. They have 1 foot forward. I think it's usually the left foot forward, with the arms striding. It's in the exact pose of all the great Egyptian statuary. But at this point, as the sculpture begins to become in the round, now it becomes divorced from the Egyptian influence and begins to rise and become masterful and unique in its own way entirely. In the Arabian civilization, we have the completion of the mosque style with Hagia Sophia, even though Hagia Sophia is Byzantine and it is not yet Islamic, as the Ottomans will take it over later. That tells you the inwardness of the Byzantine civilization. It's not classical and doesn't belong with the classical civilization. The Byzantine civilization belongs with the cave world of the Judeo-Christian Islamic civilization. And so it's some of its finest forms begin to come in here. And then in the Baroque, in the West, we've got the reign of oil painting now, from Titian to Rembrandt, which is the best oil painting ever done in the West as far as Spengler is concerned. I'm in full agreement with him here. These are grand masters, Titian to Rembrandt. And then classical music is just beginning to get off its feet with Orlando Lasso and Heinrich Schütz. Classical music will become, though, will steal the thunder from oil painting to become Faustian civilization's best and finest art. Just as sculpture was for the Greeks, its best and finest art. So that's the period of the formation of a mature artistry. Then we have another subphase for perfection of an intellectualized form language. So the intellect is coming in more and more now. In Egypt in the 12th dynasty, we have the creation of the great pylon temple and also the great labyrinth, the famous labyrinth. In the Greek world, this is the period of the maturity of Athens now, just after the Persian Wars, 480 to 350, the Acropolis, the period of Myron and Phidias and Praxiteles and all the greatest of all the great Greek sculptors come just after the Persian Wars, where a boundary act prevented a pseudomorphosis. If the Persians had won against the Greeks and taken them over, then Greek civilization would have been stuck with a pseudomorphosis, a very heavy Persian pseudomorphosis. But since they drew a boundary act with Thermopylae in the 300 and so forth, they prevented that from happening and managed then to maintain and express the uniqueness of their own form language. The world is a sensuous, physical, beautiful body, which is best expressed in their art. Nobody did sculpture better than the Greeks. I don't even think the Hindus did. So there's that, and then with Islam now we have the Umayyads and the victory of featureless arabesque. So arabesque is unleashed, this aniconic art form, and it's unleashed and it just goes across this form language over all the walls, over all the mosques, and all the most beautiful mosques start coming into being as Islam and the Umayyads migrate north across North Africa on into Spain with one of the finest architectural arts in the world. And then in the West End, this is the period now of classical music, Bach to Mozart, where classical music comes in. The best classical music that was ever created comes in during this period of the apogee of the arts, and the end of classical oil painting. Oil painting at the same time begins to wind down from Watteau to Goya. I don't think there's any question of that as a decline of the great oil painting tradition from Titian to Rembrandt. And then finally we have another phase, exhaustion of strict creativeness, dissolution of the grand form, end of the style, classicism versus romanticism. In Egypt, there's no real record. He says there's no remains of this period. This is the period of the second, coming up on the second interregnum. And then this is the age of Alexander now in the Greek world. And the last great Greek artists, Lysippus and Apelles, Lysippus in sculpture and Apelles in painting. And the Corinthian column comes in now. In the Arabic world, this is the period of about 800, about Harun al-Rashid, and the creation of the great dynasty at Baghdad, and the proliferation there of a very cosmopolitan, it's a very sophisticated culture in Baghdad. And then we have in the West classicistic taste in architecture. The end of classical music is now coming in with Beethoven. The end of oil painting is now coming in with Delacroix. So that's the end of the culture period, and now we begin to shift into the civilization period proper. I love how ruthless he is here in his description of the decadence of civilization. I don't think anyone has ever been quite this damning and condemning of it. He says it's his description for the civilization period: existence without inner form, megalopolitan art as a commonplace, luxury, sports, nerve excitement, rapidly changing fashions in art, revivals, arbitrary discoverings, borrowings. And this is made up of three subphases. And the first one he puts in quotes, modern art, art problems, attempts to portray or to excite the megalopolitan consciousness, the transformation of music, architecture, and painting into mere craft arts. That's pretty thoroughly damning, man. And for this, in Egypt, this is the Hyksos period now, who bring in the second interregnum. And they bring in the Hyksos, whereas the Persians tried to conquer the Greeks and failed, the Hyksos conquered the Egyptians, and they succeeded. The Egyptians were not able to make a boundary act against them, and so the Hyksos then bring in what's the city, Tanis. They bring in the Delta Valley, a totally alien style of art and architecture. They're not particularly good at it, and so they conquer Egypt for about a century or so. And there's a lot of mixed Semitic names. The name of Jacob first occurs amongst one of these rulers, Jacob El. So these are a mixture of possible Indo-Aryans, according to Toynbee, mixed with Semites, and it's just a mess. They conquer Egypt, and they don't really do anything culturally significant. This corresponds then to the Hellenistic epoch in classical civilization, where we have Pergamene art, and it's if you look at the sculpture of Pergamene, it's overly melodramatic and theatrical. There's a lot of attempts now in the art and architecture to simply shock. Shock value now comes in as something to take into account. You get a lot of weird, bizarre sculptures. Realism comes in, mere realism, what Heidegger would call beings shorn of being and made into mere objects. So they've lost contact with being, which is Heidegger's equivalent for Spengler's idea of the inward necessity of the civilization and its soul. So then in Islamic art we get the prime of Spanish and Sicilian art, the art of Samarra. Samarra has that weird mosque that's a spiral-shaped mosque. It's not a cavern. What's it doing there? How does that form have anything to do with the Arabian world as cavern mentality? So some alien forms have come in here. And then in the West, this is the 19th and 20th centuries, classical music begins to wind down with Liszt, Berlioz, and Wagner. Wagner, just like Pergamene in the Hellenistic period, is an art that's based on, it's bombastic, overly theatrical. It's beginning to shift into melodrama and working on the nerves to produce a sense of shock value. and in painting Impressionism from Constable to Liebel and Manet. And then he also throws in here American architecture, which the neoclassicism of the Jeffersonian period, which he obviously did not like. So the second subphase of civilization is the end of the form development. Meaningless, empty, artificial, pretentious architecture and ornament, imitation of archaic and exotic motives. A lot of imitating of other cultures starts coming in now as the civilization begins to lose its own sense of itself because it's morphologically exhausting its possibilities into a state of thermodynamic equilibrium. And so for Egypt, we have the 18th dynasty. We have the giant art now coming in, the Memnon Colossi. You know, those two huge statues are coming in now. And Ramses II with his gigantic tomb. So now the culture has to express itself with might and mass, since it's losing metaphysical effectiveness. The only way it can express itself is through, again, shock and trying to... it's a very sort of fascistic, tyrannical approach to art now that views the spectator as a mere victim of its aesthetic sensibilities. This corresponds to the Roman period, and we get the Colosseum, an indiscriminate piling of all three orders, the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian, just all thrown in and mixed together, with triumphal arches coming in. And then we get the art of the Seljuks in the Islamic world, and the Oriental art of the Crusades, and then in our case, he's got from 2000, and he's left it blank. I think he's hit it right on the money there as far as the decadence of this art goes. Quite a bit of contemporary art can be said to be pretentious, meaningless, empty, artificial art that is just pointless and shouldn't even exist. That really comes in around 2000 here. Finally, phase 3 of the finale. Formation of a fixed stock of forms. Notice the archai are becoming depleted. They're becoming semantically depleted, and now they're rigidifying and freezing into a standardized set of archetypes that will not change from this point on. Imperial display by means of material and mass and provincial craft art. So the architecture now gets even bigger and more impressive. We have the gigantic buildings in Egypt of Luxor, Karnak, and Abydos. Huge, huge forms of architecture. And then in the period from Trajan to Aurelian, we have gigantic fora, thermae, colonnades, and triumphal arches. Again, giant art and architecture designed to impress. And with the Islamic world, we have the Mongol period and the gigantic buildings, as in India, in the case of the Taj Mahal, which is not a Hindu native form. It's pseudomorphic from the Arabian civilization. It's a world as cave-type construction that's gigantic. And that's it. The West still has 2 more stages to go through here to correspond to these last 2 stages of gigantism, but I think we can already see the tendencies in the West toward gigantism, especially in America in the 1930s with the gigantism of the Golden Gate Bridge, Hoover Dam, all these great, huge, major forms of architecture that are meant to impress with might and mass. America's already headed in this direction. So I think we'll leave it there for this video, and for the next one, discuss the political forms and their morphology.